He was the most famous man on the planet, the voice that made an entire generation lose its mind, the hips that got banned from television, the movies, the comeback, the white jumpsuit under the lights in Las Vegas, and standing just outside the spotlight for 14 years was a woman the world only ever saw as a reflection of him, the wife, the widow, the keeper of Graceland. What the cameras never caught, what the tabloids never understood across 50 years of guessing, was the one thing that explained all of it. Not the marriage, not the divorce that made headlines on 3 continents. A teenage girl in occupied Germany who walked into a stranger's living room one autumn evening in 1959 and looked at the most desired man alive, as though he were simply a person who looked lonely. At 81, Priscilla Presley has finally said it without flinching. He was the only love of her life. And the story of how she got there, through a childhood spent moving from base to base, a courtship the world would question forever, and a divorce that everyone misread, is the kind of story that makes you wonder whether we ever understand the loves we judge from the outside. She was born Priscilla Beaulieu in Brooklyn in 1945, though Brooklyn was only the first of many places. Her father, a Navy pilot, died in a plane crash when she was 6 months old. Her mother remarried an Air Force officer, and from then on the family moved wherever the military sent them. By the time she was a teenager, Priscilla had learned the particular skill of the military child: how to be the new girl, how to be watched without being known. In 1959, the latest assignment took the family to Wiesbaden, Germany. She was 14, quiet, beautiful in a way that made grown men forget themselves, and desperately bored in a country where she didn't speak the language. She missed home. She had no idea that home was about to find her. A man approached her at the Eagle Club, a gathering spot for American servicemen and their families. He told her he knew someone who would love to meet her, that someone was a 24-year-old soldier stationed nearby, drafted into the army at the absolute peak of his fame, hiding in plain sight in a rented house in Bad Nauheim. His name was Elvis Presley. She didn't believe it at first. Nobody would. But the invitation was real, and a few nights later she was sitting in his living room, surrounded by his entourage, certain he would never notice a 9th grader in the corner. He noticed. He sat at the piano and sang directly to her. He asked her about herself, not about what she thought of him, which was the only question anyone ever asked her later. He would say afterward that she was different, mature beyond her years, the kind of stillness he couldn't find anywhere in the noise of his own life. But the timing was impossible, and everyone around them knew it. His tour of duty was ending. He was returning to America, to the career waiting to resume, to a country that had spent 2 years missing him. The romance, if you could even call it that yet, looked like the kind of thing that ends at an airport. It didn't end. For the next 2.5 years, Elvis stayed in contact across an ocean, and Priscilla held on to a connection nearly everyone around her assumed she had imagined. Therefore, when the invitation finally came to visit him at Graceland, she fought a battle her parents never expected. A 17-year-old asking to fly to Memphis to stay with the most scandalous man in America. They resisted. Hard. But Elvis made promises about chaperones and schooling and propriety, and somehow the impossible was negotiated. Priscilla moved to Graceland to finish high school, graduating from an all-girls Catholic academy while living inside the strangest household in the country. This is the part the story usually rushes past. Before she was his wife, before she was anyone's idea of a celebrity, she was a teenager doing homework at the kitchen table while Elvis Presley filmed movies in Hollywood 3,000 miles away. She was building a life inside his world, learning its rules, learning him. And she was waiting, the way she had waited across the ocean, for a man whose attention the entire planet was competing for. They married on May 1st, 1967, in a brief ceremony at a hotel in Las Vegas. She was 21. 9 months later, almost to the day, their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born. From the outside, it looked like the fairy tale had finally closed its loop. The girl from the military base had married the king of rock and roll. The waiting was over. But the inside of that fairy tale was lonelier than anyone watching could have guessed. Elvis was gone for long stretches, working, performing, recording, surrounded always by the men who managed his life and the women drawn to his fame. The house that millions dreamed of visiting could feel, to the young wife inside it, like a beautiful place to be left waiting. She had shaped herself around him since she was 14 years old. She had learned his moods, his hours, his world, his rules. Now she was a grown woman in her 20s, beginning to wonder who she might have been, if she had ever once had the chance to find out. And here is where the story turns in a way the public got exactly backwards. In 1973, Priscilla Presley filed for divorce. She walked away from Graceland, from the name, from the most famous marriage in America. The world read it as a scandal, a betrayal, a woman leaving Elvis Presley while he sat at the top of the mountain. What it actually was, by every account she has ever given, was something far harder to put on a magazine cover. She left because she had never once gotten to choose herself. Not at 14, not at 21, not for a single year in between. She could not become a whole person inside his orbit. She loved him. That was never the question. She simply could not keep disappearing into the gravity of him. They divorced in October 1973. But they did not become strangers. They walked out of the courthouse holding hands. He kept calling. She kept answering. The marriage ended, and somehow the bond underneath it refused to. That is not how you separate from someone you've stopped loving. That is how you separate from someone you love too much to keep losing yourself inside. Then came the morning that closed nothing and ended everything. On August 16th, 1977, Elvis Presley died at Graceland at the age of 42. Priscilla got the call. She was 32 years old, divorced 4 years, and suddenly, the grief she felt had no socially acceptable shape. She wasn't the wife anymore. The papers said so. But she was the mother of his only child, and she was the woman who had known him since she was 14, and there is no legal document on earth that tells your heart it isn't allowed to break. What she did next is the thing that should have told the world the truth about her all along. When Elvis died, the estate was nearly gone. Graceland was hemorrhaging money, costing a fortune just to maintain, and the inheritance left to Lisa Marie had dwindled to around $500,000 against enormous upkeep. Advisors told her to sell the house. It was the obvious move. It was the easy money. She refused. Instead, Priscilla took control of the estate and made a decision everyone called reckless. She would open Graceland to the public. In 1982, the gates opened, and the gamble that should have failed became one of the most successful preservation stories in American history. Graceland turned into a landmark visited by hundreds of thousands every year, and the estate she had been told to liquidate grew into a fortune worth hundreds of millions. She saved his home. She protected his name. She built an empire to make sure the man she divorced would never be forgotten. And then, for the next 40 years, the world asked her the same question over and over. Why didn't she remarry? There were relationships. There was a long partnership and another child. But there was never another marriage. Never another moment where she stood in front of someone and called it forever. Interviewers kept circling it, and she kept declining to fully explain, the way people do when the truest answer is the one they're least willing to hand to strangers, That is the thing the Empire and the headlines never captured. The woman who built a business out of his memory was, in the quiet of her own life, never quite able to give that part of herself to anyone else. Not because she was trapped in the past, because some people meet the defining love of their life at 14 and spend the rest of it knowing that whatever else comes, that was the one. In her later years, speaking with a candor she had spent decades withholding, Priscilla finally stopped softening it. She has said plainly that Elvis was the love of her life, that no one ever came close, that the connection they had was the kind you only get once. She talks about him now, not as a celebrity she was once attached to, but as the person she understood better than anyone and was understood by in return. When asked late in life whether she had ever truly loved again, the answer in everything she says is the same. Not like that. Never like that. There is a whole philosophy of love buried in that, if you sit with it long enough. We assume the divorce was the end of the story. We assume leaving means you stopped loving. Priscilla Presley spent 50 years quietly proving the opposite. That you can walk away from someone to save yourself and carry them with you for the rest of your life. That the leaving and the loving were never the contradiction the world insisted they were. At 81, she is still the guardian of Graceland, still the mother who buried her own daughter Lisa Marie in 2023 and kept standing anyway, still the keeper of a story she has finally decided to tell on her own terms. She no longer needs anyone to understand it. She walked into a stranger's living room at 14, looked at the most wanted man alive, and saw a lonely person. She has never, in any way that counts, stopped seeing him. Priscilla Beaulieu met Elvis Presley one autumn evening in 1959. She married him, left him, mourned him, and protected him across 6 decades. And at the end of all of it, asked to name the love of her life, she didn't reach for anything grand. She just said his name. Maybe that leaves a question worth sitting with. Not about her, but about the rest of us. If you can leave someone and still love them for 50 years, were we ever right to call that leaving the end of the love at all?